Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Said What. I'm Krishna and this is the show where I dive into interesting comments made by notable figures from across the world, whether it's finance or the broader business world, and dig into the stories behind them. Today, I have three very interesting comments for you. It's about whether Apple can really make its iPhones in India, getting all our electricity from renewable energy, and for the third one, something that the World Bank's president recently said. Let me get started. When Trump was on a roll and increased tariffs on Chinese goods to 145%, global trade took a hit. But for Apple, it felt personal. Although he has paused tariffs for now, but you can never be certain when it's him. The thing is, this wasn't just about paying more to ship goods across the Pacific. It was a direct threat to how Apple builds everything: iPhones, iPads, MacBooks, because almost all of it, almost always, has been made in China. See, Trump's trade war was chaotic. Companies rushed to beat the tariff deadline, freight costs soared, and inventory piled up. Apple even chartered jets to fly iPhones out of its plant in Chennai to the US just to stay ahead of tariff clock. But the real question wasn't how quickly Apple could fly phones out. It was, could Apple ever actually move out of China? That's the bigger and the most important question. At first glance, it looks like Apple's working on it. Tim Cook recently in their earnings call said that most of our US iPhones will be manufactured in India. iPhones, for your context, contributes to more than 50% of Apple's revenue. The company has been setting up plants in Chennai and there's been a lot of noise about India becoming the next great manufacturing hub. So is Apple finally pulling the plug on China? The answer to this, in my mind, seems a little impossible. But I'm not an expert. So I was listening to Patrick McGee, former Apple reporter at the Financial Times and now the author of the book Apple in China, to understand his view on this. In an interview with the rest of the world, he said that this whole idea that Apple is moving to India is more perception than a reality. He adds this caveat. If next year you buy an iPhone and it says made in India on the box, that phone will not be any less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other iPhone you have ever purchased. And the reasons are deep. In a podcast interview, Patrick McGee said that Apple didn't just find China convenient. It helped build modern China's manufacturing muscle. He said that Apple trained the Chinese workforce from scratch. When Apple wanted translucent plastics, miniaturized circuits, or aluminum castings with perfect color gradients, those skills didn't exist in China. Apple flew in its best engineers to teach them. He describes it as a tactic knowledge, the kind of experience you can't write down in a manual. You can only learn by doing.
They come to work in the factories. Well, they don't have the skill set. It's not like they have experience with translucent plastics and miniaturizing circuit boards into making it into the iPod. So what happens is Apple begins to send plane loads of engineers eventually, first into dozens of factories, but eventually into hundreds of factories. And if you think about the caliber of talent at Apple, we are talking about the best employees, the best engineers in America coming out of places like Caltech, Stanford, MIT, hired from Dell, Motorola, etc. And they are just doing the Ivy League equivalent of hardware engineering training and teaching the Chinese how to do this, that, and the other thing. So, the term for this is tacit knowledge. Difficult to define tacit knowledge, difficult to write it down, but we're talking about experiential know-how in the art of making things, in the logistics and orchestration of these things.
In fact, Apple trained over 28 million workers in China since 2008. Patrick McGee calls that more than just outsourcing. He compares it to America's Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II, but for China. And Apple poured in not just labor but capital. At one point, $55 billion a year into Chinese infrastructure, talent and machinery. So yes, Apple might screw in the final parts in India, but everything leading up to that, which is chips, screens, sensors, camera, is still built in China. And the suppliers, mostly Chinese firms like BYD, Luxshare, GoTech and Wingtech. He calls it the red supply chain. And when you zoom out, the scale difference becomes even starker. Apple went from making zero phones in China in 1999 to 200 million a year by 2009. It took them 10 years to do that. In contrast, India began assembling phones in 2017. By 2024, India had made 25 million, barely a tenth of what China managed, and at a much slower pace. And yet, the challenge is not just scale, it's speed. In the podcast, Patrick McGee tells a story of Apple engineers visiting a Chinese factory that needed a complete machinery overhaul. They expected it to take 2 or 3 weeks, which was done overnight. Foxconn, Apple's biggest suppliers, had replaced everything without being asked just to win future orders.
One example that's not in the book, I talked to an engineer who said, we were in this big facility and all this machinery needed to be removed. And we thought, okay, yeah, well, they should be able to get it done in 2 or 3 weeks. They show up the next morning and it's all gone. And it's just inexplicable speed. The engineers have no idea how the task was accomplished that quickly. But that's the sort of thing that Foxconn was doing routinely when it came to setting up a production line, expanding that line. It'd get to the stage where Apple would realize, oh, we really need another production line for more of these orders, and then find out that Foxconn on their own initiative had already done it.
That's the kind of speed and initiative that China offers, and India isn't even close to matching it. United Airlines even set up dedicated first-class flights to carry Apple engineers to and from China 3 times a week. That's quite crazy. But now Apple is stuck. Patrick McGee puts it simply. Apple needs to walk out of China, but they can't run. If they leave too fast, they risk a crackdown from Beijing. And if they move too slow, they're vulnerable to geopolitical shocks like Trump's tariffs. And if that wasn't complicated enough, Trump, out of nowhere, apparently told Tim Cook that Apple shouldn't make iPhones in India. But later, some sources say that a government official has said there is no change in Apple's investment plan in India. Now, I don't know what to make of this situation. Let me know what you think. Now, for the second comment. See, everyone talks about net zero electricity. But does that mean 100% renewable power is possible? Kashish from the team had this question and he was listening to the Cleaning Up podcast, where an expert named Andres Lindberg talked about whether we can run an electricity grid entirely on renewables like wind and solar. Technically, yes, we can do it. But practically, he explained it would be incredibly expensive, about 65 trillion euros extra globally by 2050. He said this.
When you have renewable storage and engine power plants, and there are some key findings of that study, and that is that you save up until 2050, you save 65 trillion euros if you have also the flexible engines, and you reduced the CO2 emitted because you can move much faster implementing renewables. So you save 21% of CO2. And on top of it, you reduce the 88% curtailment that you would have if you only had renewables and storage.
But why is getting to 100% renewable energy so tough? See, the main challenge is something called grid stability. If that sounds like Greek and Latin to you, I get it. That's exactly what I thought when Kashish mentioned it. But it's interesting. Let me take you through it. See, grid stability basically means making sure electricity keeps flowing steadily and reliably. See, there are 2 parts to it. See, supply must always match demand exactly. When you switch on your lights, that electricity must be generated at that precise moment. The grid's frequency and voltage needs to stay steady, like Europe's standard of 50 Hz. Any imbalance can cause blackouts or equipment damage. Traditional power plants like coal, gas, or nuclear help maintain this stability because they can adjust their output quickly. They have large spinning turbines that naturally help things keep steady. Think of these turbines as giant bicycle wheels. They resist sudden changes. See, renewables like solar and wind are trickier. They depend entirely on weather conditions, which we can't control. Solar panels produce energy when the sun shines. Wind turbines spin when there's wind. This unpredictability makes it harder to match supply with constant demand. Also, wind and solar usually don't have heavy spinning parts. They produce direct current or DC, which needs to be converted to alternating current or AC, causing fluctuations. See, when renewables make a smaller portion of the grid, like 20 to 50%, it's manageable. Grid operators balance variability using traditional plants, but pushing renewables towards 80%, 90% or 100% amplifies 2 big challenges. First, variable supply versus constant demand. If there's a cloudy, windless day, you might not have enough electricity. On sunny, windy days, you might produce too much electricity and have to discard some. Second, reduced grid inertia and frequency control. Renewables lack the inertia traditional plants have. Without inertia, sudden disturbances like a big power plant shutting down can sharply alter grid frequency, leading to blackouts. For instance, this April, Spain and Portugal faced a huge blackout because the grid didn't have enough stability mechanisms to handle rapid changes when several renewable plants disconnected. So, how can we practically maintain stability on a renewable heavy grid? There are three main strategies. First, overbuilding renewable capacity. See, you can build way more renewable capacity than you typically need. If you have 5 times the necessary solar and wind installations, even bad weather might still produce enough electricity. However, this method is costly and inefficient. It's like buying 5 cars so at least one always runs. A recent Ember report illustrated this clearly. Getting to 50% renewables isn't hard, but pushing 100% means nearly 5 times the solar capacity and massive battery storage, making electricity 3.5 times more expensive. Second, energy storage. Storing excess renewable energy in batteries or other storage systems like pumped hydro or hydrogen can help. Batteries can quickly respond to grid fluctuations, acting like shock absorbers. But massive shortage requirements make this approach expensive and impractical. Similar to oversizing, huge batteries would mostly sit idle waiting for rare emergencies. Third, flexible backup generation. A more practical solution involves using a small amount of flexible on-demand generation like gas, turbines or engines powered by biogas or hydrogen that you only use when renewables fail short. Andres Lindbergh explained that allowing just around 4% of electricity to come from flexible fossil gas plants during peak times could save 65 trillion euros compared to a purely renewable approach. That's because those last few percentage points of renewable reliability are extremely costly. Flexible generation sources can quickly adjust their output on demand, unlike baseload plants, which is nuclear or coal, that run steadily. Natural gas plants are highly flexible and ideal for quickly balancing renewables variability. So, can an electricity grid run entirely on renewables? Technically, yes. Practically, it's very challenging and expensive, especially as you approach the final few percent. Most experts suggest aiming for about 80 to 90% renewables using a small portion of flexible backup sources like gas to handle rare peaks or dips. This balanced approach significantly reduces cost and complexity while still cutting carbon emissions dramatically. Of course, relying on flexible backup has its own challenges, like ensuring a secure and reliable supply of fuel, but that's a discussion for another day. Now, for the final comment. By now, you must already be aware how uncertain are the times we live in. There's so much happening in the world that you never know what might happen tomorrow or what Trump might say tomorrow. Ajay Banga, president of the World Bank, spoke to CNBC TV18 recently. He spoke across a bunch of topics, but for the sake of this episode, I'll stick to what he said on India. See, India aims to become a high income country by 2047. That's a huge leap from where we currently stand. And he even says that this is a really cool target to aim for. It's a vision, he argues, that can genuinely unite and inspire a nation. But here's the catch. Getting there isn't straightforward.
Getting from here to there, I don't measure things in straight lines.
He's acknowledging the fact that growth isn't really a linear path. At some point, we'll be in hyper growth phase, and sometimes things might not even move a little bit. Today, as I mentioned in the beginning, the world sits on a tightrope with global economic uncertainties. There's tariffs, trade wars, Trump's unpredictable tweets, and so many more things that are happening on a more local level. This is exactly the sentiment that Ajay Banga shares as well. He insists that if uncertainty and volatility persist, definitely there will be a slowdown in global growth. Yet, he quickly adds an optimistic note.
But you don't know that. You don't know if tomorrow or the next 10 days, 2 or 3 trade deals get signed and all of a sudden people will say less uncertainty and it changes.
He even gives the example of the recent UK-India free trade agreement as an example. By the way, we wrote about this in the Daily Brief recently. I'll link it in the description below if anyone wants to check it out. Coming back, the UK-India thing is not just another trade deal. It symbolizes a larger global trend where regional and bilateral agreements are redefining globalization itself. He captures this evolution brilliantly, pointing out that in the last decade alone, 100 such trade deals have come into existence, reshaping economies silently yet significantly. But there's a deeper issue here. The traditional model of globalization, which is outsourcing jobs from developed countries to developing ones, purely based on labor and logistics cost advantages is no longer sustainable. The real fundamental issue, he emphasizes, is how this model, beneficial in theory, disrupts individual lives in developed economies without interfering immediate replacements.
Unless you believe that that is a one-to-one relationship where that person seamlessly moved into an outstanding, higher productivity, higher paid job, which did not happen, then you have to believe that this model cannot persist forever.
So, what's the new model? Here, he lays down a compelling vision centered around 5 strategic sectors that hold the key to sustainable job creation: infrastructure, agriculture as a business, primary healthcare, quality tourism, and value added manufacturing. When talking about infrastructure, he doesn't merely mean roads or buildings, but rather what infrastructure enables.
Is infrastructure. It's construction, but then what it enables. Bridges, roads, airports, schools, skilling institutes, digitization, healthcare, electricity. And the World Bank is very focused in that space.
In agriculture, he draws inspiration from India's cooperative giant Amul that requires an example like Amul to be repeated many times over, underlining the potential for cooperative agriculture to transform rural economies. Primary healthcare is another essential sector that Ajay Banga spotlights, creating jobs while significantly cutting healthcare costs through early diagnosis of diseases like diabetes and heart disease. Tourism, he argues, remains deeply undervalued in India. He starkly compares that
Just remember to keep it in context. New York City gets 62 million a year, just so we know what we're talking about. London gets 64 million. Paris gets 64 million. So India, with its culture, beaches, mountains, history, food, shopping, fabulous people. I mean, there's much more that we can do here.
India's number, for context, is somewhere around 20 million people. Manufacturing could also be transformative, but it isn't without risks. He points out that logistics costs in India remain alarmingly high. His message to the policymakers is clear.
To be honest, if we don't seize it quickly, the moment will pass us by because others are moving on to it very quickly as well.
In the regional context, he brings another insightful critique. Intra-regional trade is abysmally low in South Asia. He proposes concrete solutions like connecting electricity grids between countries like India and Sri Lanka, realistic yet powerful examples of regional integration. It's clear that he's advocating a shift in global thinking, one that is more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive, and perhaps that's exactly what we need in these uncertain times. That's it for this episode. If you have any feedback for me, please let me know in the comments below. Hello. Today I have. It's about whether Tim Cooker.